Right then, so we're going to do some science and technology, and the question that we're going to focus on is examine the role of ethics in controlling human experimentation. And really what's going to be talked about in this essay plan could be applied to any essay on human experimentation generally, but this is the kind of question that you'd probably get asked, and what it's asking you is how far, or to what extent really, should ethics control human experimentation. So before we begin on actually planning out the essay, just a bit of a recap on structure of how you would write your essay. So remember, this is an AO1 question. So you give a quick introduction, just 4 lines really, and we'll come on to introduction in a minute. Remember, no conclusion with an AO1 essay, unless it's an applying one, say for virtue ethics or something. And really we're looking for around 6 paragraphs. And remember that to write an excellent essay, you need to write perfect paragraphs. If you write 6 perfect paragraphs, you're going to have an excellent essay. And the way that we write perfect paragraphs is by using our L-Peel structure. So L, the first line or first couple of words in your paragraph should link to the previous paragraph. Something like, following on from this, however, on the other hand, and so on. Then your next sentence or next line is your point, and each paragraph should have 1 point fully explained. No more than 1 point, just focus each paragraph on 1 clear point that you explain fully. Your next sentence is that explanation. Remember, using words like because, this means that, this shows that, to explain in detail. Then for every single paragraph you must give an example, fully explained and linked to the point you are making. Do not rely on the examiner to know what you are talking about in your examples. You must explain it clearly to them, and you must link your example to the point you're making. And finally then, the last part of your paragraph is a link back to the question, and the easiest way of doing that is by using words from the question in that sentence. Just a bit of a kind of a point on this term examine here. Remember that examine means that you must look at both sides of the question in your answer. So it's different to AO2 because you're not weighing something up, you're not coming to a conclusion, an evaluation. All you're doing is you're showing that you understand that there are 2 sides to the argument and you're giving both of those sides. Okay, so we're just going to focus on what this question actually means and what would go into an introduction. So remember, your introduction should only really be about 4 lines long. So what we're going to discuss now, you would need to condense down into some kind of, quick introduction, 4 lines or something. So the question is, examine the role of ethics in controlling human experimentation. Now, the key here is that you've got to appreciate that there is absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind that to some extent there needs to be ethics involved in human experimentation. Because if there isn't, people are exploited, they're harmed. Think about the Nazi experiments where there was no care at all taken for human life, no ethics involved, atrocities taking place there. And so the question is not asking, should ethics be involved, yes or no? It's asking, to what extent should it? So it's not black and white, it's not, it's much more complicated than that. And if you just give a black and white answer, a yes or no answer, you're not really appreciating the complexity of the question or the issue at hand. You've really got to discuss how, yes, there does need to be ethics involved, but really we're focusing on to what extent. What are the positives of it being involved, and what are the negatives, and how should it be involved? What should it control? What shouldn't it control? Another further point to make here is that many people would say that human beings have value. You could link that to religion, made in the image of God, sanctity of life, that kind of thing, and so should be treated with that value. Adding to the complexity of the question, not all experimentation on humans is the same. You can discuss various types of human experimentation, drug testing, live vivisections, psychological experimentation. Don't forget, embryo research, stem cell research is included in human experimentation. And obviously, the extent to which ethics should control human experimentation will be different depending on what kind of experimentation you're doing. So for example, drug testing might be seen as much more ethical than, for example, live vivisection. So if you're talking about the extent to which ethics should control human experimentation, if you're talking about live vivisection, you might say, well, ethics should control it to the extent where it's never allowed because it's causing so much harm and disregard for human life. Whereas with drug testing, ethics might control it to an extent to prevent harm, however allow the experimentation to take place for, that discovery to take place and things. And that's the key. If ethics controls too much, then it could limit discovery and not allow important experimentation to take place. So just to reiterate again, this question is not black and white. It's not, yes, ethics should control human experimentation, or no, it shouldn't. The real question is to what extent. And unless you answer it to what extent, you're not really appreciating the complexity of the question. And so that's really, if you want to be accessing those higher grades, that's what you need to be doing, really discussing in what way and to what extent should ethics control human experimentation. So the way I'm going to structure this essay plan is by having an argument for ethics controlling human experimentation to an extent, and then counter-arguing it. Now, you don't have to do it like that. You don't have to do argument, counter-argument. It's not an AO2 essay, remember. But, I feel like for an essay like this, it's quite a good way to do it. But you don't have to do it like that. Your essay, your paragraphs, you could, for example, have 3 arguments to say why it should control to an extent, and 3 arguments why it how it should be limited, how the role of ethics should be limited. So it's really up to you. As long as you're doing both sides, it's fine. So the first argument for ethics controlling human experimentation to an extent is that quite clearly, if there is no ethical guidelines whatsoever, no control over human experimentation, then there could be a huge amount of harm done to human beings, and we run the risk of descending down the slippery slope. And remember, the slippery slope is, if you accept one thing happening, who knows where that could lead to. We may accept some human experimentation, which causes harm, for example. If you allow that, then who's to say that in 5 years' time we don't allow something that causes a bit more harm, and then eventually we might be allowing things which causes death, and so on. And so by having no controls whatsoever, we run the risk of descending down that slippery slope. And there's lots of experiments from the past, like the Nazi experiments and Unit 731, which have had no ethical guidelines and have shown a complete disregard for human life and caused lots and lots of harm. So for example, remember, don't rely on the examiner knowing these examples. Explain what Unit 731 is, that it was a Japanese research facility during the Second World War that experimented on prisoners, Chinese prisoners, to develop weapons and things. And during those experimentations, they did things like live vivisections, which obviously will have caused a huge amount of pain and shown a complete disregard for human life, and draw on the fact that not a single person survived. Every single person was killed, and so this is not ethical, and so should be controlled because of that disregard for human life and harm. And so linking back to the question, so human experimentation should be controlled so that humans are not harmed, that they give informed consent and so on. So what is the role of ethics? It is to ensure that where possible, human beings are not harmed, and that there is a regard there for human life and the value of human life. Okay, so then a nice simple counter-argument to that is that if we control human experimentation with ethics, that can limit discovery. So for example, if we are putting limitations on human experimentation to avoid harm to human life, sometimes harm needs to be done in order to make new discoveries. And so if we are putting ethical guidelines in place which says you can never cause harm to human beings, that could eradicate a whole range of experimentations that could take place, which could generate really excellent new discoveries. And so, for example, drugs may need to be tested which do have side effects which could cause harm to human beings. And so, therefore, linking back to the question, human experimentation should be controlled, but not to such an extent that it limits discovery. So, for example, you might have an ethical guideline in there which says that harm to human beings should be avoided where possible. So it's not black and white. It's not saying it should stop it or it should allow everything. It's somewhere in between. So it's ethical if. Remember that word "if" is really important when we're talking about science and technology. So remember, it's ethical if it prevents harm to human beings where possible, and where that harm is necessary, it is generating new discoveries which can be useful to our society. And it's that kind of discussion which is going to give you a really mature, well answered, good answers to this question. So go into that detail, go into that complexity in your answers. So following on from that, kind of a counter-argument to the counter-argument, if you like, because some discoveries may be unethical in themselves. So not only can the human experimentation be unethical, for example, live vivisection, but actually the reasons that it's done could also be harmful. So going back to Unit 731, not only were the experimentations unethical because they caused harm, but actually the reasons why those experimentations were done in the first place could be deemed unethical because it was to create weapons which is harmful to society. And so again, linking back to the question, therefore, human experimentation should be controlled so that it is only done to produce discoveries that benefit society. Okay? And so, again, it's not black and white. It's not saying all human experimentation is wrong or all human experimentation is right. It's saying ethics should control human experimentation to make sure that if it takes place, it is done so that the discoveries benefit society, and that makes it ethical. Okay, so another argument that ethics should not control human experimentation to an extent is this idea that ethics should not stop completely certain types of human experimentation just because some people might disagree with it. And really here what we can draw into is embryo research, because embryo research is a very, very controversial topic, very controversial area within ethics. And lots of people, lots of scientists think that embryo research is extremely useful, but some people think it is completely wrong. And so the argument here is that ethics perhaps should control what we do with embryos to appease those people who think it's wrong, but should not stop it completely because embryo research has such great potential for benefiting society. So just to explain that a bit further, many Christians believe that life begins at conception, and so the use of embryos is murder and should never be done. However, scientists believe that the pluripotent state of embryonic stem cells, in other words, embryonic stem cells are in a state where they can create any cell within the body and therefore are very, very useful. That will allow, embryonic stem cells can be used to develop treatments for degenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease to recreate those cells in the body which don't work. And so therefore human experimentation should not be controlled to some extent where certain types of experimentation is never allowed to be conducted. So in other words, what we're saying here is that yes, human experimentation does need to be controlled for various reasons that we've discussed, like making sure that it benefits society, that it doesn't harm human beings, etc. However, it should not completely stop what could be potential types of human experimentation. And really here we're using the example of embryo research. So it should not stop embryo research because it is so potentially useful. But then the counter-argument is, however, there should be some control over embryo research as human life is valuable. So again here it's not black and white. We're not saying it should not be done, it should be done. We're saying it should be done, but there needs to be some role of ethics in there to control it to a certain extent. So here really we're focusing on the idea that human life is valuable. So just to explain that a bit further, according to Christianity, humans made in the image of God and should be treated valuably. Here we're talking about the sanctity of life and so on. And so therefore, there needs to be ethical guidelines in place for embryo research to make sure that that value of human life is respected wherever possible. And so, for example, the guidelines that are actually in place at the moment say that embryo research should only take place within the first 14 days of the embryo's life cycle, which is before the appearance of what's known as the primitive streak, because before then it's not considered a human life. And so therefore ethics should put some controls over embryo research so that the human life is respected. However, what we've said before is that it shouldn't put so many controls in that it never happens, because it can be very useful. However, there is a recognition that human life is valuable, and so therefore to an extent embryo research should be controlled. And then the final argument against ethics controlling human experimentation is this key idea of, well, what ethical theory do you actually use? And I focused here on Kantian ethics as causing a major problem for human experimentation, because what I'm saying here is we should not follow Kantian principles that say no human should be treated as a means to an end, because that's going to stop all human experimentation, which obviously is an issue because human experimentation can be so useful to society. So Kant said that as all human beings are rational, all humans are valuable and should not be used as a means to an end, which would mean that humans should never be used in experiments because this treats them as a means to an end. So they're being experimented on, for example, to develop a new drug, so that's using them as a means to an end. And if we followed that principle, that would mean that we could never do any experimentation whatsoever, which is very problematic. So, for example, it would mean that humans could not be used to test drugs or used in psychological experiments to understand the human mind, both of which are very useful. So, linking back to the question, so ethics should control human experimentation, however, not using Kantian ethics, as this would disallow all human experimentation. You could have a counter-argument to that, which says, you should use utilitarian principles, whereby as long as the majority are happy in society, then human experimentation could take place. And that would really fit in nicely to what you've said before about only experimentation which benefits society can take place. So that is really a utilitarian principle, that as long as the experimentation that's done benefits society, then that makes it okay. Okay, so just to summarise and to maybe suggest some other points that we could have included in this essay but didn't. To summarise then, what we're focusing on is what type of human experimentation is taking place, and some are more ethical than others, and so therefore the role of ethics will be different depending on which type of experiment is taking place. We're thinking about the reasons for which it is done, and again, the role of ethics will be different depending on why it's being done. We could talk about different which ethical theories we would use. Other points you could include are things like what's the role of ethics in controlling the funding that comes to human experimentation, where that funding comes from, what it's used for. Other things that we could talk about are what is the role of ethics in ensuring that the public are aware of what goes on in human experimentation, what's the role of ethics in making sure that what is done both pleases and benefits society, and so on. So there's lots and lots that you could talk about, and I think the key really is for you to break it down and think about it from both sides of the argument.